Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm both delighted and honored today to participate in this very important conference to share with you the experience from China. So 2008 marks the 30th anniversary of China's economic reforms. So over the past 3 decades, China has truly produced a growth miracle. The GDP of the nation has grown at 10% per year. And the real per capita income has increased more than tenfold. So now China is the second largest economy by purchasing power measures, and China is also the second largest trading nation in the world. Back in the 1970s, China was a poor developing country with near subsistence levels of living. But the growth has lifted more than 200 million people out of poverty and has helped improve health, education, and other social standards. So what is the key to these remarkable successes? It has been widely believed that crucial factors are China's reliance on market, on price signals, privatization, and its integration into the world economy. So while these are very general facts, which I believe are known to many of you, so my presentation today will only focus on one specific aspect of China's economic reforms, so namely the agricultural price reforms. So I'll first describe China's agricultural pricing and commerce under central planning, and then I'll summarize the major developments of reforms since 1978. So we'll also discuss the impact of economic reforms on agricultural production, commerce, and food security. And in the end, I'll try to summarize what are the main lessons from China's price reforms. So before starting the details of the presentation, I would like to share with you a few personal observations. So I was in Beijing about a week ago, and I visited a supermarket near the home of my relatives there. So the supermarket was huge, and the goods were plenty. So even in the cold winter, there are just dozens and hundreds kinds of fresh vegetables, fruits, and meat on display. There were also very large varieties of high-quality processed goods. I had the impression of, it's really an impression of abundancy and prosperity. Okay. What I saw forms a sharp contrast with the situation 30 years ago, when I was a kid growing up in Beijing. At that time, there were serious food shortages, even in basic food supplies. So during the several months in winter, basically the residents in Beijing only consume 2 kinds of vegetables. One is Chinese cabbage, another one is Chinese greens. So it was indeed very subsistence living standard at that time. Although I have not had an opportunity to visit a supermarket here in Caracas, because I actually arrived after midnight early this morning. But I talked with the people on the plane. The impression I formed that Venezuela is experiencing similar type of shortages as in China 30 years ago. Right? So this one is unusual because if measured by income, the income of Venezuela is about 3 times higher than the income of China. But it seems that the serious shortages, it's inconsistent with the income level that you have. So my presentation today is to seek answers for those answers behind the observations I have just mentioned. We want to understand how economic reforms has changed China's food supply in the past 30 years. And I hope the discussion will have important implications for Venezuela. So let me go into some of the specifics. Right. So during the central planning period, China pursued a heavy industry-oriented development strategy. The role of the food industry was to provide basic supplies, and the agricultural surplus was extracted by the government in support of the industry. So the government set very low prices for food products so that urban wages can be kept very low. So therefore, as the government planned, more resources can be devoted to capital accumulation for industrialization. Under central planning, price controls were excessive. In 1978, this is on the eve of economic reforms in China, the government set procurement prices for 113 commodities. And at the retail level, the government controlled the sales and prices of 138 commodities. This was in the period of 1978. So for each of the agricultural output, there were two prices set by the government. One is called a quota procurement price, and another is an above quota price. So both of these prices were way below market levels. So actually these prices stayed nearly constant over a long period of time. So how did China implemented these very restrictive price controls? Actually, they were carried out through a system named Unified Procurement and Unified Sales. So in the beginning of the year, the planning authorities of the Chinese government would pass on these production targets to lower levels of the government, to provinces, prefectures, townships, all the way down to the level of the people's commune, the basic organizing unit in the rural areas. And the communes were responsible for carrying out specific production plans. At that time, the state monopolized the procurement of farm products. So after each harvest, state agencies would go to purchase the products, transport them to cities, and then state-owned grain or grocery stores would manage the final sale of all these products. Individual and private agencies were prohibited in specializing in food commerce and long-distance transport. So because supplies were limited, the government had to use rationing to allocate major farm products, including grain, meat, cooking oil, and eggs. So I still remember that for a family of four of my family living in Beijing, the monthly allocation of the goods was 2 kilograms of meat, 1 kilogram of cooking oil, and 1 kilogram of eggs. Okay, that's for a family of four for a month of allocation. So you can imagine it was very hard living by today's standard. So economists understand well the problems with price controls. So if you suppress prices to arbitrarily low levels, some firms will find it unprofitable to operate in this environment, so they shall leave the industry. So for those who choose to stay, they would have less incentives to improve production. So these are the general economic phenomena analyzed by economists anywhere in the world. It has been shown in China, as in many other developing countries, that under price controls, farmers would have very low incentives for agricultural investments. They would offer low labor efforts, use limited fertilizers and machinery, and are less willing to purchase and implement new technologies. So in the related industry of food processing and food production, price controls would reduce the incentives to improve all sorts of production facilities, including storage, transportation, refrigerating capacities, production equipment in general. So low prices would also result in inferior quality goods, and also leading to a less variety of the goods in these industries. So because of these reasons, there were widespread shortages in food supplies in all central planning economies. In 1984, I actually had a chance to visit a very large multi-floor supermarket near the Red Square in Russia. Okay. I was a student at that time, traveling from Europe, taking a train back to Beijing. So I had a couple of days spending in Russia. So in contrast to the large size of the building, you see this is near Red Square, a main department store there. There were simply not many goods in that large size stores. So there were long lines within that shop to purchase each individual commodities, including, actually, there was a very long line forming in the shop. So I just followed that line to see what is really being sold there. That line was so long. Actually, it turned out it was ice cream. Right? So because the ice cream was not often offered in Russia at that time, so when it appeared, people form a long line, right, just want to try to get the taste of it. So when central planning was pushed to the extremes, it could result in major disasters. Okay? Maybe some of you have heard about the Great Leap Forward movement that occurred in China between 1958 to 1961, okay, which caused a great famine with up to 30 million excess mortality, excess death. So that was a very tragic lesson learned from China's blind pursuit of the development strategy and also the mistakes of central planning. The event was very complicated, but central planning definitely was the key factor that resulted in the major failure in agricultural production. So the poor performance of the Chinese economy, especially the agricultural sector, urged the Chinese government to engage in broad and far-reaching reforms started in 1978. So agricultural pricing and commerce reforms progressed in 3 stages. The first stage, as I indicated in these slides, began in 1978 and lasted in 1984. Okay. The initial policy changes included a package of 3 reforms that took place in China. The first was a change of institution from collective production to household-based production. In Chinese, we call it household responsibility system. So basically, it involves the removal of the people's communes and allocated land to individual families for their own production. The second one was market and planning reforms. The main purpose was to reduce excess production quotas and promote local free markets. The third one was pricing reform. So the government decided to dramatically raise agricultural prices, which was suppressed or kept low for a long period of time under central planning. The change was very aggressive. Okay. So in 1979, as I indicated in these slides, the state raised average quota procurement prices for grain one time by 20%. The prices of oilseeds increased by 25% and cotton by 15%. So after fulfillment of government procurement quotas, farmers may sell their products at a price above quota price. These prices were raised by 30 to 50%. Here I'm talking about a one-time change occurred in 1979 to dramatically increase the prices of agricultural products. So in a short period of 4 years, in 1982, by 1982, average agricultural prices increased 52% relative to the 1978 level. So to provide extra incentives for production, the government also lowered the prices of agricultural machinery, fertilizers, and pesticides on average by a level of 10 to 15% during the same period. Okay. So this is a coordinated move of 3 reforms that took place in 1978 and 1979. So the result of these reforms were very remarkable. So this table shows the growth of agricultural production for the central planning period. I'm trying to find the cursor here. Okay. So this column, this first column refers to the rate of production growth during the central planning period. It was at a rate of 2.9%. Need to get this out. Oop. So it's 2.9%. And the second column is the growth performance in the first several years of economic reforms. So you can see that during the central planning period, the average was 2.9%. In the first initial years of reform, the growth suddenly jumped to 7.7%. So almost 3 times as high as the central planning regime. Growth in individual sectors also jumped to much higher levels. So in 6 years, this is the spectacular performance performed by the Chinese agriculture, is that in 6 years, the total value of Chinese agricultural production went up by 42%. Okay. So we're talking about a large population of, at that time, probably 800 million people in the rural sector, and the total size of that sector raised by 42%. So economists have done very detailed studies just to investigate what were the sources of growth during that period of time. So about half of the growth was attributable to institutional changes, the shift from collectivization to household-based production, because that solved the incentive problem of production. The other half of the growth was actually due to the results of price and market reforms, because higher prices and market opportunities induced farmers to use more productive inputs and to raise crop intensity. So that combined market and price reforms played a key role. So once the reform began, there was no turning back. The rapid growth in agricultural production boosted the confidence of the government, who started to believe that reform was indeed the most effective way to solve China's food problem. So there was the famous saying by Mr. Deng Xiaoping, right, who was considered to be the architect of reform, of Chinese economic reforms. The saying goes as, black cat or white cat, it is a good cat, so long it catches mice. Right? So with this very practical philosophy in mind, China continued to build on its previous successes and wanted to further expand the market. Okay. So actually at that time, there was another factor which pushed the government to further lose the control in the agricultural production and sales market. Because with rising procurement prices and fast rising agricultural production, the government had to devote a huge amount of money, equivalent to 14% of its budget, to agricultural subsidies. Okay. So that was a huge burden by the government. So when these mounting budgetary pressures existed, the government thought it was a good time for the government to give up its control so that the government could shift the burden of price subsidies to the general consumers at that time. So that one was actually a practical issue that the government had to deal with. Okay. I want to quickly go through the second stage and third stage of reform very briefly. I know time is very tight here. Is that in the second stage of reform between 1985 to 1992, China gradually developed market institutions to replace the old system of unified procurement and unified sales. In 1985, China announced the elimination of mandatory production and the procurement of agricultural products. A new system of establishing purchasing contracts between the government and the farmers began to take effect. So this system can be best described as a dual-track pricing system. So for grain, oil crops, and cotton, farmers negotiated production contracts and prices with the government. But after fulfilling this production quota or contracts, they could sell the remaining products directly to the free market. So for other products, such as meat, vegetables, poultry, and aquatic products, prices were liberalized completely. So in the second stage, unlike the first stage is simply raising the price, in the second stage, market institutions were established. In 1992, after 14 years of experiments and reforms, the government decided to completely liberalize the markets. In 1993, 90% of provinces officially eliminated grain rationing, and since then, state-owned purchase of farm products continued to decline over time. So finally, market became the dominating force in the agricultural pricing and commerce. So today, the Chinese government still purchases more than 10% of its total grain output with the purpose of simply stabilizing prices and actively managing a grain reserve. So although the purchase prices are predominantly determined by the market. It is also worth noting that in recent years, backed by its large holding of foreign currency reserves, China has increasingly used foreign trade to adjust its domestic imbalances in grain market. Okay. Now, let me turn to a few figures that report the progress of price reforms in China. So in this chart, x-axis presents the years and the y-axis represents shares of agricultural products that were sold at different prices. You can see that in 1978, the state controlled nearly all agricultural prices, which is represented by the red color. Market reforms accelerated in speed. So then in 1992, about 80% of the farm prices were determined already by the market. And now markets completely dominate the sales of farm products in China. So here you can see that today, the state basically retreated from the entire agricultural product markets. Okay. So this chart describes the progress of price reform for the entire retail sector, okay, including all commodities, not only food and agricultural prices. So the pace of reform also moved in 3 stages: gradual change, acceleration of reform, and later on in the 3rd stage, complete market dominance. So China was used to be called Red China, right? As in the color of the national flag indicates. But as you can see from this chart, the color of the Chinese economy is no longer red, it is blue, so representing the influence of the market in some ways. But officially, China still calls itself a socialist market economy, okay, which is also consistent, I think, with the color of this chart. Right. Yeah. So, what have been the changes? I have also only described you the 3 stages of changes, but what have been the changes in food prices over time? This chart provides a long-term view. So prior to reforms, prices had stayed almost constant for 3 decades, as you can see. But since 1979, when the government dramatically raised farm procurement prices, 3 output price indices continued to rise until the mid-1990s. So you see this, the red line on the top is the retail price of grain, blue is the retail price of food, and this yellow line is the procurement of farm products. Okay. So in less than 20 years since the beginning of the reform, major food prices indices rose by 600 to 700%. The growth of these prices was about 2 times higher than the general rise in the consumer price index. Okay. So this line, I cannot point here, but this green line in the bottom is the index of rural industrial products, including fertilizers and farm machinery. Okay. It has increased over time, but the rate much slower than the output prices. So the difference between the growth of output prices and input prices may greatly stimulate food production. Okay. So the relative price of food have gone up by more than the general industrial products. Okay. So economists have long understood the power of price incentives. Once suppressed prices are allowed to rise to market levels, producers would have incentives to work hard, use more inputs, and adopt innovations and technologies. So these actions will lead to raise the supplies of farm products, and the income of farmers will rise also. So higher prices will also induce more investment into food processing and production industries, leading to improvements in storage facilities, refrigerating capacities, tend to induce better services and products from packaging industries, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, and also better transport. So both the quality and the variety of goods should also improve with these relative price changes. So also another point, throughout history, China has faced the challenges of feeding its very large population. So food shortages and famine have claimed millions of human lives, even in China's recent economic history, as I mentioned, the Great Leap Forward movement. So could the reform solve China's food problems and enhance its national food security? This was a question not so clear in the mind of the policy makers at that time. But over the 3 decades of economic reforms, I think we have already found out the answer. So this is what I'm going to show you through a few graphs. So this chart shows the use of agricultural inputs in the past 50 years. So there has been some increases in irrigation areas indicated by these blue bars at the bottom. But as indicated, the changes is not really dramatic, showing that China has fully utilized conventional methods of farming. However, the use of fertilizers and farm machinery has accelerated during the years of reforms. Actually, you can see that the use of fertilizer was almost doubled in the first 5 to 6 years of reform in the initial period. The total use of fertilizers and mechanical power continued to increase at a very fast pace throughout this entire reform period. Okay. This chart shows China's per capita grain output and availability over the central planning regime and the reform era. These two lines move closely, and the difference reflects net food input and export. So one is production per person. Another one is production adjusted for input or output per person. Inputs or exports, rather, right? So you can see that before reforms, per capita grain availability was generally below 300 kilograms per year, which was not far higher than a subsistence level. So therefore, when there were negative production shocks, as it happened between 1959 and 1961, it caused a major famine in China. So economic reforms have helped push up per capita food availability in China to a much higher level, a range between 350 to 400 kilograms per year. So although there are still fluctuations, as you can see, in food supply, but it occurred as it occurred in 2003, but it did little harm to affect the supply of basic nutrition to the population. So with the progression of reforms, the production of all farm products moved up to higher levels. As this chart shows, for per capita consumption of meat and aquatic products. So the meat is represented by the orange line, and aquatic products by the blue line. So for the entire central planning period, Chinese people did not have the fortune to eat much meat or fish. But today, the consumption of meat and aquatic products is about 10 times higher than the level in the late 1970s. The consumption of milk and eggs shows very similar patterns. So per capita egg consumption went up very rapidly in the early years of reform and continued to grow in recent years. So milk consumption increased slowly but persistently, but showing very accelerated growth in very recent years. So actually throughout history, Chinese people have mainly obtained their calorie intake mainly from stable food, especially rice, rather than from meat or dairy products. So therefore, some people, including some scientists, say that that's the reason why Chinese people are short and generally weak. Okay, right? But that is no longer the case. Okay. So younger generations born in the 1980s, yeah, they have much improved nutrition than earlier generations. So now Chinese are much taller and much heavier, I think, and also healthier, okay. So, I mean, some of you who like basketball may know that Chinese has produced outstanding athletes, such as Yao Ming and Liu Xiang. So one is the tallest player playing in the NBA, and another one is the champion and also the world record holder for men's event, track events of 110-meter hurdles. And he has broken the world record. I think since the Summer Olympics is going to be held in Beijing this summer, I think many people are looking forward to see very healthy generations of young Chinese kids are going to compete in the World Olympics. Yeah. I think this chart is very relevant to many of the distinguished guests in this room. The food industry has also benefited enormously from market and price reforms. So this chart describes the growth of output values of food industry, including the aggregate value and by sector numbers in food processing, food production, beverages, and tobacco processing. So today, the size of the food industry is more than 10 times larger than 1980. I'm talking in real terms, okay? With annual output value exceeding 300 billion US dollars. It looks from the chart that the growth of the total output value is still accelerating, even occurring today. This table tells more details within the food industry. It reports the value of total food production and exports by ownership type. Here, I want to point out to you the yellow color represents the private enterprises, and the green area represents foreign enterprises invested in China. Okay. So it is interesting to note that in 2005, this is where the data is based on, private enterprises took 49% of the market share in food processing, while foreign firms had 37% of the market share. The market shares of these two types of firms in food manufacturing were 32% and 49% respectively. So they also took larger shares in exports than state and the collective firms. So since the food industry was monopolized by the state-owned firms at the inception of economic reforms, so these figures reveal that private enterprises has experienced very fast, very rapid growth. And the food industry has also attracted large amount of foreign direct investment into China. So you can see these foreign firms, they began investing in China during the reform period, produce large quantity of foods, sell it to China, and then they manage to export large quantity in today's economy. Okay. I think I need to accelerate, but let me briefly mention about 2 points. So far I have discussed the impact of price reforms on production and commerce, which are all desirable outcomes. So one potential concern of the market reforms lies in the question, would higher food prices hurt the poor, thus causing social resistance to change? So China actually did not encounter this problem because the benefits of reforms far exceeded the cost of higher food prices for most groups of the population. So the society as a whole has enjoyed large welfare gains. Okay. So during the reforms, China used a strategy of crossing the river by groping the stones. So meaning that they proceeded very cautiously along the way. So they always moved to the next steps of reforms, building on previous successes. So at the beginning of raising agricultural prices, low-income rural families received immediate benefits. So to make sure that higher prices would not hurt urban residents, the government provided some necessary price subsidies in the initial years. So gradually, the government found that the population has rather high tolerance for higher food prices because the population enjoyed increased food supplies, better quality, and a much larger variety of the products. So in early 1990s, when the government observed no political resistance or social resistance to large increases in food prices, they became determined to accelerate the pace of reform and further expand the market. So for the case of China, agricultural price reforms has significantly improved its national food security. In fact, reforms has achieved some amazing results. On the same land, with the same natural endowments, weather conditions, and the same people, the supply of food have reached much higher levels. So in 1998, after grain output per person topped 400 kilograms per person in 3 consecutive years, the Chinese government actually, it's like make a formal announcement to themselves, probably as well as to the rest of the world. that after centuries of struggle, China finally solved its food problem. So by 2003, with only 10% of the world's arable land, China produced 18% of the world's grain, 27% of its meat, and 43% of its poultry products. So China's food, per capita food output actually surpassed the world average. So with these increased food supplies, the Chinese government has increasingly focused to manage a grain reserve to deal with sudden production shortfalls or severe price fluctuations. So its attention has been on distributional issues of protecting its vulnerable groups. I think this theme was emphasized with the panel speakers just now, and it was also something that the Chinese government has tried to manage to do. So the vulnerable groups in China would include the rural as well as the urban poor groups. They consider the student groups is vulnerable, and also some poor elderly. And China is increasingly, in present days, to use international trade reserves as another factor for insurance. Okay. So I want to quickly conclude by summarizing the experience of China's price reforms. So over the past 3 decades, a consensus has gradually formed among the policy circles as well as academic circles in China regarding how to deal with the food problem in China. The main message can be summarized in 3 sentences in China. First is policy, second is science and technology, and the third is productive inputs. So China's policies has always relied on markets and price signals. So here, I mean, the Chinese experience has shown that price signals and markets are the crucial factor because they can induce the use of science and technology as well as improved inputs. So actually, last week, when I was in the supermarket in Beijing, it gave me enormous pleasure to see how abundant supplies of various goods existed in the supermarket. So what I saw reminded me about the life in Beijing 30 years ago. So at that time, food supplies were in extreme shortages. I still remember before every Chinese New Year, okay, which Chinese New Year is Lunar New Year, happens either in January or February, my older brother and I would wake up at around 4 a.m. in the morning. We would go to a food store, stay there for approximately 3 to 4 hours before the store opened. We wait in line in order to buy 1 chicken and 1 fish. These are the special offers for the Chinese Lunar New Year holiday. Okay. So in the end, we were able to, have our family to have a very nice New Year meal. I would say those days are long gone in China. I firmly believe that right policies and institution can help any country to solve its food problem, just as what China has done in the past 3 decades. So thank you very much for your